particular hello to Sir Michael Barber, who's the guy who used to do my education reforms. So anything that worked was to my credit, and anything that didn't was his fault. Which I always think is the right relationship between the leader and the public servant. And the first thing I really wanted to say to you is that we spent a lot of time making change. And here's the thing, making change is not easy. I used to, by the time I finished my time as Prime Minister, I discovered that when you first propose a change, everybody tells you it's going to be disastrous. Whilst you're making the change, life is hell. And after the change is made, people assume that it was always like that, and why wasn't there more of it? So, and I remember not in education reform, but in healthcare reform, and I think you may know something a little bit about that here in the US as well. But I remember the height of our healthcare reforms, which now really have taken the National Health Service. Actually is not a huge issue right now in Britain in the same way that it was when we came to power, precisely because the reforms have had a big impact on the healthcare system. But I remember right at the height of those reforms, and which had great opposition from within the healthcare field, and I went and had unfortunately I had to have a small operation in hospital. So I go into hospital, I'm lying in the bed there, and the anaesthetist guy comes in with a very large-looking needle and leans over the bed, and he says, his opening words to me is, "Mr. Blair, I may not get the chance to say this to you again," which is not, that wasn't a great start. And then he says, "I'd just like to tell you I'm totally opposed to your health service reforms." So I learned it was never easy making change. And I learned a lot of lessons, good and bad, from the experience, so let me try and share those with you. I mean, first of all, some guiding principles, and I'll talk specifically about community schools, but I'll try and set it within the broader framework of reform. I mean, as guiding principles, well, obviously, human capital is what determines a nation's success today. I mean, it's obvious, but you need to say it and repeat it. I believe that poor education is the single biggest social injustice a child can have. A child can, especially with help, get through in circumstances of poverty, but a child that is given a poor education will very often remain poor. A child that is given the chance of a great education can make something of themselves. So education is the great human liberator, in my view. Also, I think as policymakers, I ended up feeling this about making policy in the field of education, that if it wasn't good enough for my child, it shouldn't be good enough for anybody else's. And I actually came in the end to believe that you had to approach education policy as a parent first. Right? That is what then got you in the groove, as it were. So that when you came to look at policy, you looked at it in a very, very personal way. Is it something that's really going to help the child or not? I think the other guiding principle is that money is important, and we made major changes in investment in our education system. We increased the investment dramatically, by the largest amount that any government had ever done since the war. But I am absolutely convinced money alone is not the answer. You can put as much money as you want into the system, but if you don't accompany it by the right reform, then it won't work. So those are the kind of guiding principles. What are the challenges? The challenges, and this is the reason why community schools are so important, is that the poor kids are often, even usually, in the worst schools. And they're congregated together as well, many times. In many education systems, this isn't incidentally something that's just for the US system or the UK system. You can see it all over the world. Also, many of these young people will have family problems as well as educational challenges. In other words, their issue is not just about the time they're in school. Their issue is obviously often their life circumstances. You know, how they're being brought up, the community in which they're living, the multiple challenges of life, particularly for some of the poorest and most disadvantaged children. Another challenge, and I'll be very frank about this, but it's not always a popular thing to say. I think in respect of teachers' unions, we have to seek a partnership, but we should refuse a veto. Now, that is sometimes not one of the world's most popular things to say, but I think it's important because it does set the framework within which we then try to make policy. And I think the final part I put under the heading of challenges is that when you come to failing schools, I mean, this is what we found. We could identify failing schools, and we actually took some very radical and pretty draconian measures towards them, because I believed that every time there was a failing school, that was a whole lot of children whose life chances were being shortened. But I actually also came to the view in the end that there was a problem with failing schools, but that wasn't the only problem. There was also a problem with schools that were what I would call mediocre or coasting, we used to call them. In other words, they'd be kind of, you know, moving along, underperforming, but not so drastically that people would say, oh my God, you've got to do something about that school. But actually just not doing as well as they could or should. And that also, I think, is a major issue within our education systems. So those are the challenges. Now, here is what I think about education reform, which I would say is different from many other areas of public service reform. I mean, I think, you know, the issues to do with healthcare are really, really tough. And, you know, around the world, everyone's always searching for the perfect healthcare system. And, you know, if any of your political leaders were intelligent enough, they'd go and find it and implement it. And actually, it's not like that. And many things to do with pension reform. These types of issues can be incredibly difficult. I think the interesting thing about education reform is actually we kind of do know what works. I mean, what's hard is implementing it. It's actually less hard to identify what works, what actually goes to make a good school and a good education. And here are some of the things that we came to on the basis of 10 years of empirical experience in doing reform. I think the school that's successful has a sense of its own identity.